Hello. So welcome to a conversation on Camden and its place in the world. I'll introduce the conversation first. The speakers will introduce themselves. But let me start by just asking who here lives and works in Camden or has ever done so? So most of you. Now, if I was to ask you another question, which was, what is Camden a place? You might wonder, am I an imbecile? You've just told me that you're from the place which is Camden. But the question is a great way into the nature of community. It's a great way to address larger questions. And the point of today's conversation is to see, by looking at that question, what can we unfold in the development of Camden itself and the broader question of localism, cities, and urbanization generally. What we'll do is we'll start with some general discussion on place, localism, placemaking, see how that goes. All of the conversation, I'll keep referring back to, as he'll introduce himself in a moment, the representative from Camden's planning office. And then we'll start talking more specifically about Camden and some international dimensions. We have got time in the schedule for there to be a full-on question and answer session, and in theory we'll get to that, but you are very welcome to intervene at any point and just come up with your own comments and positions. Let me start by asking the speakers to introduce themselves and address very briefly the question, what is a place and what is localism? What is it to act in and with a place? So a couple of minutes on that.
Okay. Well, my name is Yunus here, and I work for a practice called Exploration Architecture. We're focused on the subject known as biomimicry, which is essentially using nature as a mentor or as a source book of ideas for well-adapted solutions to some of the biggest challenges we face today, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, how to design the just and super sustainable city. And I've been working with Michael for the past 3.5 years. If you want me to jump straight in, I'll just go straight in. So I didn't have time to commit this to memory, so I'll read. If we start with the right page, would be a good way. You've got a
couple of minutes now. You can keep reading after, but let's just jump in.
Okay. So what is place? I guess to me, almost any space can become a place. But the difference between the two is vast. A space is merely an area that is created, in my opinion, by developers and city planners that is designed for people to inhabit through interactions. But the real challenge is that most spaces are created by drivers that are aimed at interaction around economic benefit, as opposed to social prosperity. Michael Fusselot, one of my favorite social theorists, defines space as the space in which we live, which draws us out from ourselves, in which the erosions of our lives and our time and our history occurs. And to me, this definition explains when a space becomes a place. When we are drawn out of our individualistic daily routine, and when our stereotypes and differences are set to one side, and we can come together in common pursuit that unites. And I think localism is the perfect medium through which people can recapture, abandon, or misuse spaces and turn them into places where communities can truly thrive in a sustainable way. Now, when I got asked to do this talk a couple of weeks ago, I found it quite difficult to actually explain what localism or what local action is. So I had to break it down into two definitions. To me, localism is a simultaneous understanding of the sum of our impacts on the biosphere, i.e. all of the ecosystems collectively, and the will to make a positive change from the bottom up, from the individual and community to the city, national and international. And local action is a taking advantage of local resources to implement services and projects that in turn produce abundance and prosperity. There's some great projects of such local action. There's the Cardboard to Caviar in the north of England, which essentially uses disabled children to collect waste cardboard from the local restaurants, cafes, everywhere, and turn it into a high-value commodity. There's the Bristol to Brixton Pound, which is a local currency project that have a number of benefits, including increased local wealth, development of local businesses, and divestment from economically destructive activities. And finally, there's a great example of the Biospheric project in the north of England again, which effectively uses aquaponics, or nutrients from fish, to grow vegetation on top of the roofs. And that, in the local area, has made some tremendous changes. Crime rates have dropped there by 60%, drug rehabilitation has increased by 80%, and the community is bound around this place, and it keeps on expanding and again and again. And interestingly, all these projects are moving around the way in which nature works, through cyclical metabolism, where there's no concept of waste or excess. And finally, I think that to act locally is to realize that change is merely a challenge to our ingenuity. And Margaret Mead, one of my favorites, has said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Thanks.
Hi. I'm Les Koski from KSR Architects. We're a Camden-based practice, very local, and we have been here for many years and seen the changing face of Camden. I'll start big. Our Earth is 12,000 kilometers in diameter, but we occupy just the last 1 kilometer, the crust of that little Earth. And in that, we form places. We form places to live, we form places to work, we form places like this where you can gather together for purposes such as this or music. And those places are, by their nature, very complex. They're complex because they are formed of a number of layers, such as a landmark, or a route, or a space, or an environment that interests you. They're also personal because they mix in with that your emotional interpretation of that space. Did you have a great experience there? Was it a good time? Was it a bad time? And that affects how you picture and ultimately carry with you the identity or the construct of that particular space. So for me, for example, my picture of Camden Town is that it's at a crossroad. It's on the primary north-south route through London. It's also on the primary east-west route, and that's the intersection, so Camden becomes a kind of a hub. You have to go through Camden if you're going east-west in this particular part of London. Camden is, for me, also this wonderful little canyon of small shops with overblown advertising sculptures hanging on their facades. But Camden, for me, is also primarily the unique and very extravagant people that populate Camden at varying different times. It is also the changing time. Having, from a practice that we used to go and hang out at the Camden Palais on Wednesday evenings, and now my children might go and hang out at Coco. So how much time you're in the space changes your perception of that, and that perception also changes in the course of the day. You'll hear Ed will talk a little bit later about the nighttime economy of Camden. Camden's a very different place after the sun goes down. Locally, we're here at the invitation of CTU, Camden Town Unlimited. And CTU really support the creative industries of Camden Town. What makes Camden attractive to creative industries? It's good quality or interesting quality, affordable space quite close to the West End. That's really primarily why the industries such as ours, architecture, advertising, marketing, gather in this particular place. So what happened? Last year, the government made a little tweak to permitted development in planning legislation. They basically said that if you have an office building, you can change that to residential use, and that planning permission will be automatic. You have to go and tinker around the other things like windows and stuff of that sort, but basically you are permitted, under permitted development, to change the use of that space. So what's happening in Camden? All the great spaces, all those interesting spaces that we occupy as creative industries are also equally attractive as residential conversions. So Camden is basically, through this government action, the government has done this for very good reason. They said, we need more housing. Absolutely fine, sympathize with that, but that's a national and a regional problem. There is a local problem that is being caused by permitted development. So we're losing the very quality of spaces that makes Camden attractive to creative industries. And this has happened in the context of a very interesting paragraph, last thing, which comes from the Secretary of State for Decentralization, if you believe that such a position actually exists in government. And that's a fellow called Greg Clark. And Greg Clark wrote at the launch of the new localism bill. Well, the Prime Minister said the time has come to disperse power more widely in Britain today. And the Minister for Decentralization said, for too long, central government has hoarded and concentrated power. Trying to improve people's lives by imposing decisions, setting targets, and demanding inspections from Whitehall simply doesn't work. It creates bureaucracy, it leaves no room for adaptation to reflect local circumstances, or innovation to deliver services more effectively and at lower cost. And it leaves people feeling done to and imposed upon, the very opposite opposite of the sense of participation and involvement on which a healthy democracy thrives. So I can't quite reconcile that with the fact that they are taking our spaces away. So I think we'll leave that for discussion.
My name's Tegan Bukowski. I am an architectural designer at Zaha Hadid, and I also started a nonprofit called Artist Activists that does various youth empowerment projects with kids around the world, ranging from a radio station that we, in Ghana, where we taught kids how to run a radio station as well as teach agricultural best practice over the radio, to an orphanage that we're currently designing in Haiti. So I think that there are also already some really interesting themes that are developing here, sort of tensions between designer, government, and communities where placemaking is concerned. I think that's actually, it's really interesting to think about the sort of spectrum of roles that exist where placemaking is concerned. So I'm a little bit interested in the fact that we're primarily architects and urban designers and planners up here rather than community organizers, because place really is, to me, at its base, it's community-oriented rather than designer-oriented. Architects are concerned with the architectural icon, which is a bit too discrete to necessarily enforce place in a space. And I think that urban design is a bit too overreaching to create place. So I think that there is some sort of a mediator that's needed to create place. I think that's community. And it's really hard to talk about what exactly that is, because it changes so vastly from one community to the next. I think that some of the traps that architects, being an architect, that we fall into is thinking that we can create a complex that can somehow create a place that could potentially look like a development of sorts. But what we end up creating in the end is globalization space, which is just a proliferation of suburbia or of airport infrastructure or malls around the world, because that's all that, at the end of the day, the architectural icon can be, is an architectural object. So I think that the role of the architect in creating place should be to create an architectural armature, something that can be then inhabited by individuals, businesses, and community leaders with whatever that community needs. So I'm not exactly sure what that architectural armature is, but if place making is the goal, I think that's what we need to move towards.
Great.
Over to me. My name's Guy Neville. I'm an engineer at Max Fordham's. We're environmental engineers. And I suppose for laymen here, that means that we work with architects to design environmentally responsible buildings, and also to think very carefully about the spaces and the quality of space within them. I am an engineer, not an architect, so I think that discussions about place I should probably best leave to the architects for their esoteric answers. But what I would like to do is perhaps touch on a couple of more technical and practical things based on some work that we've been doing recently. And I suppose, if pushed, I'd say a place is somewhere that has its own identity. But it's only really a place when people relate to it. And there are various aspects there, whether it's social, cultural, psychological. But in each case, it's about that connection between the people and their surroundings. And we've been doing some work recently around greening cities. And a lot of the urban landscape, when you talk about greening, you look at landscape architecture, and there are elements of greenery that are brought in. There are trees, but they tend to be more individual items, as opposed to thinking about it on a much grander scale. For example, parkland, and there's significant benefits when you talk about greening on a larger scale. Not only are they beautiful spaces, they're psychologically pleasing to be in. But they have other aspects. They absorb pollution. There was an article in the Evening Standard a couple of days ago, I think, suggesting that up to 3,000 people a year in London die as a result of pollution. And some studies that we've looked at suggest that if you green over a large area, you can absorb about 50% of the particulate matter that's carried in the air. So they actually, greenery cleans the air for us. It enhances biodiversity, no surprise there. It attenuates stormwater, and actually, particularly in large cities like London, where in the summer we have problems with overheating, getting more greenery into a space helps to deal with that, and can drop the temperature by a number of degrees. So there are some significant benefits to introducing more of that into a space. What does it mean to act locally? I guess, to my mind, it's taking responsibility for your actions. It's thinking not only about benefits to yourself, but the interests of those around you and the rest of the community. In some cases, I guess it depends on the scale of the community, and if you're doing things, it's easier if you can see the results of what you put into place locally rather than elsewhere around the rest of the world. I think there's some interesting things that have been going on, the change to the drive towards local food, people wanting to understand where food is coming from, how it's made, the resurgence of independent coffee shops, microbreweries, all these sorts of things. It's the kind of stick it to the man mentality. We don't want large supermarkets telling us what we should be eating. And I think the same thing is starting to happen with energy. We've gone through a long period where energy costs have been incredibly low, but actually they are starting to increase, and people are starting to take a greater interest in it. And there is an interest in a growing interest in design and a growing interest in energy efficiency, and people wanting to start to take responsibility for their own energy use. And recently we've done another piece of research which was around heating London. It's providing energy to London and meeting the UK energy needs over the coming years. And there's some massive issues cropping up. We've got increased population, we've got tight carbon targets which we have to meet across the UK and also to meet the EU requirements. And there's quite a lot of inaction in government policy at the moment. So one of the big things there is heating buildings. It's about 2/3 of our energy use across the UK. So one of the big solutions is not about building new power stations or thinking about renewable energy. It's some simple things like insulation and taking our inefficient terraces that we've got and wrapping them up nice and warm. So basically taking a bit more responsibility for ourselves and therefore for the community around us.
Thank you. So my name is John Manicheri. I work as an architect and urban designer in Stockholm, although I'm born and somewhat bred in London. And my job is specializing in some of the similar themes as Guy, environmental sustainability, but possibly slightly earlier in the design process, so maybe more, I think Guy would say, abstract. And I also run a project on the side called Future Perfect, which is an event a project basically trying to stimulate better and different conversations on how we deal with sustainability and treating it more as an opportunity. On the issue of space and place, I think that there's a relatively simple kind of step through of how you can get to grips with the difference between space and place. And so what differentiates, I think, a dot on the map or something in Cartesian space is essentially a subjective perspective on it in the first instance, and sometimes in the planning literature it's called the worm's eye view as opposed to the eagle's eye view. But that's not really enough. That's too simplistic a distinction. I think Guy touched on this. I think what really defines place is meaning, and that's something that is applied to forms and absences, so empty voids and things. And it doesn't have to be what we create. Mountain landscapes can be places and can have meaning even though we didn't make them. And so I think the subjective and the injection or the overlay of meaning is what's really crucial. One thing I think is very important though in the conversation about place is that I don't think places are just small things which we have access to or we can manipulate. I think that it is credible to talk about our place in the world or in the universe, because I think we have a unique form of consciousness or cognition that can deal with that. We can apply meaning at very grand scales, and I think we shouldn't lowball our capacity to think big and to conceive big. I think that's a mistake in the place and local-oriented conversation. I think one of the problems with place and space is that we live in an age which has been overrun by a certain kind of thinking, well, a particular kind of thinking that's driven by the theory of economics. And in economics, it is about subjects, but it's about commodified subjects. It's about subjects with very simplistic reaction models. And beyond that, there is no scale. There's not really, and there certainly isn't meaning in economics. And I think that's one of the reasons why what Tegan is referring to, architects end up commodifying spaces and calling them places, because we're thinking through a very debased model of the human subject. So I think subjectivity, meaning, and multiple scales, for me, gets us into a place conversation, and why that's such a damaged and problematic a field of stuff, and why this kind of conversation has been sort of kicked off is because I think there is a problem led by a certain economic model. Ed, share with us who you are and what you do, and then I'm going to feed you some things. But just give a little bit about what the Planning Office does and how you work.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ed Watson and I'm the Assistant Director for Regeneration and Planning at Camden. So I suppose at a broad level, I'm responsible ultimately for helping facilitate community engagement in the planning process, be that through neighbourhoods and neighbourhood planning processes. I'm responsible for, through economic development functions, engaging with the business community in Camden and doing what we can to support the business community to thrive and prosper and deliver benefits for Camden residents and economic growth for Camden businesses. And I also run the traditional planning services, so the place shaping service, which supports the delivery of long-term plans for places. So our local plan, which guides decisions on individual planning applications. And then finally, I run the development management service, which processes all of those planning applications that come into the council every year.
So kind of to start the conversation, Les came up with some pretty fruity, I may use that word, commentaries on the role of on the government's mandate for decentralization of placemaking and some of the planning processes. What's your response to his critique of that shift?
I'm broadly supportive, of the point that the government has, I think, slightly misfired on some of these issues. I think it's a matter of grain or scale. So I think the government inevitably has tried to create a national response to a problem it was experiencing outside of complex and fine-grained places like Camden. So there are parts of the world where they are desperate to stimulate the housing market. There are parts of the country where they feel that local communities haven't necessarily been allowed to create their own solutions for responding to the need for more housing and more jobs, and therefore their philosophical answer to that is to provide and promote more community-led planning, neighbourhood-led planning, on the idea that if you empower people, they will ultimately come to the right solution. And alongside that, stimulating local housing economies through allowing out-of-date and redundant office buildings to be converted to a more useful, residential use to address the housing shortage we have in the borough, so in London actually, and the country. But when you apply it to a complex and fine-grained place like Camden, you find that you start to destroy some of the things that make Camden special. So we had a particular issue in Primrose Hill where a well-known, probably throw a stone from here to Primrose Hill over the railway tracks, where a well-known local mixed kind of business and community facility at Utopia Village was going to be turned into residential. And the community, quite rightly, were upset about that because it felt like the opportunity for things that they valued in their community, the thing that made it feel like a successful place, which was a mix of people living and working and eating and buying together, was going to potentially be lost as a result of this change. So I think I don't personally agree with the government's intentions, but I can see why they did it. But even if you follow through why they did it, I think it's had unintended consequences that are bad for a place like Camden.
Just let me check. Just so we don't get too boring or too detailed. I'm not suggesting you're boring.
No,
Who knows that there is a Minister for Decentralisation, just to kind of check in? Okay, it's not many of you. So we're already maybe firing on too many cylinders. Can you explain what problem you have in a little more detail, and then comment on what Ed said and how you would like it to be done better, decentralised planning initiatives? Unpack it a bit so people have a sense of what's really going on. Because if they don't know who the Minister of Decentralisation, if they don't know he exists, or she, then we need to explain why there's a problem.
The problem is, and I think it's a generic problem that goes back many years, is that there are always two sides to a planning coin, and you never look at the two simultaneously. And I recall earlier on, through some previous recessions, we used to turn offices to housing. And I would go to the planning department and say, we've calculated there's 2 million empty square feet of office space. We'd like to create housing. And then we'd go through the planning policy book and it'd say, the local authority would actively support the creation of new housing. Great. Go to the other section and say, the local authority would actively resist the loss of employment opportunity space. And so you cannot reconcile the two. And then I would say to the planning officers, come on, mate, how do you square this up? Says, planning is long-term, and planning thinks big. And what we do is we smooth out the irregularities in the market, which means there may be too much vacant office space this year, but who knows what the position will be next year. And so we end up grinding into a kind of an inertia. And maybe that's the problem that accumulated in the housing market, that there's an undersupply. But there's an undersupply for many other reasons that the government could be addressing. Not the one of an instant fix, whereby we then go to short-termism and we end up with a problem that we destroy neighborhoods which have accumulated a terrific quality and character over time.
And so what would for you be the ideal balance between planner-led planning and community-led planning? Or what would be, just frame, what would be the ideal model for you?
I actually have quite a lot to say about that later on in your script.
We can come back to that.
What I can say is I can offer a couple of other things. What we really need is, we go back in the old political, the benevolent dictator planner, which is somebody who has the right idea and has the political power and muscle to push it through and makes everybody happy at the end of the day.
And we're going to run about 90 minutes, right? Is that right? Because these guys have so much to say that probably from my schedule will go longer in the discursive bit than I had imagined. So I really need you to jump in, because the bit where I was going to say is all up to you is going to come later than expected. So if you want to say things at any point now, say it, and I'll also try and kind of force you into the conversation. Yes, you. Woman drinking beer.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask Ed, perhaps if you could explain to me and the audience exactly how neighbourhood plans are developed. Because just to explain, there's some other changes in planning, national planning policy in the last 2 years, whereby several thousand pages of planning policy was actually streamlined down to about 20 pages of very simplified, quick, get in there, just fill as much as possible. Sorry, but there was as a vestige of the localism bill, a neighbourhood planning capacity as well. But although about 18 have been, I think, enacted, only 2 neighbourhood plans nationally have been accepted. So I was just wondering, there seems to me to be a conflict between the sort of national level sweeping generalisation and then the actual difficulty of developing a robust neighbourhood plan.
Just so, because maybe everyone is not 100% up with what you're to do. I think what you're implying, just to make it sort of super simple, and maybe everyone knows this, is that the government has basically stripped away quite a lot of planning regulation to liberalise the planning regime at the local level, right?
No, I mean, I think it's sort of, it goes against the localism bill. It liberalises planning at national level.
Right.
Simplifies it, whereas it conflicts with the localism bill, which came.
Right. Okay. So that's helpful. So you're saying that government policy is a little bit conflicted. They want localism, but actually they're damaging the potential for it through their planning regime at a high level.
So I suppose the question is, how do the neighbourhood plan, how do they get
So that's a specific question. What is your take on the mandate that the government has deposited, both in terms of national planning and in terms of the localism thing? But if you can pull out of your answer the sort of the theme, which is placemaking. Let's see, are you making a place or not? Is the government helping you make a place with their planning regime or not?
Yeah. Okay. To start with the kind of the reduction in the guidance, I personally think that's a really good idea. You know, so there was, for the non-planning geeks, there were literally this table's length twice worth of planning-related documents and guidance, which the planning profession and government said, well, I'm sure we can do better than that, and they produced something called the National Planning Policy Framework, which sets out much more clearly the ambitions of the planning system and how it should operate. And I think that's helpful because it makes it easier for people to engage in the system. There will inevitably be complexities of case law and all that sort of stuff that will sit below that, but nevertheless having a fairly concise statement of what the planning system should achieve, including how communities should be involved in delivering place, discuss, you know, is a worthwhile activity. In terms of how the government's vision that it sold of neighbourhoods creating plans and making change in their places has translated into reality, I think that the government has missold that vision. Because it promised on the one hand to communities that they would be empowered to write and deliver their own plans, which would allow them to take control over the future development of their places. But on the other hand, they probably quite rightly, from my perspective, said, well, you can't just develop any old plan. Your plan needs to be broadly in conformance with the local plan that the council's got, because otherwise you might be wanting to do something over here that isn't consistent with what the council, through its processes, thinks should happen overall in the place. And also that it needs to comply with all the other, you know, regulations and complexities that go alongside ensuring that plans are a useful tool to help the right development happen in the right place and in the right way. And that evidence can be everything from environmental evidence to economic evidence to demonstrate viability. So actually, on the one hand, they've kind of promised a relatively straightforward bottom-up utopia driven by local communities, but on the other hand said, oh, by the way, it's actually bloody complicated and you haven't got as free a hand as you want. Also, somewhere in between the two, I think they misunderstood that a lot of people would take the opportunity to form neighbourhood forums and engage at a community level, not to embrace the opportunity to positively shape their areas and encourage growth, but actually to do the opposite and to put the brakes on it. So it doesn't surprise me that there are some neighbourhoods who haven't brought forward neighbourhood plans because they are probably inconsistent with stories and messages around growth. On the other hand, it doesn't surprise me they haven't brought them forward because actually it's quite a complicated thing to do.
So you're saying that the government's mandate, which was touted as an opportunity for local level individuals and groups to get more stuck into planning, isn't really working for various reasons. But let me ask you this, given that it's your job, as you described it as the headline, to get communities into planning, how are you fixing that problem? Okay, because so, you've defined the problem, but surely it's your job to solve it.
Yeah, well, it's our job to help communities engage meaningfully in the development process in things that shape the places in which they live and work. And that can happen on a number of levels. We are actually, whilst we have not been out banging the drum and saying Camden wants to be #1 for neighbourhood forums and neighbourhood plans, we actually do have the highest level of neighbourhood forums, emergent and agreed, in London. So, you know, we do have a lot of local-led activity, and that doesn't surprise me because for the reasons that Les was describing, Camden is a good place. It's a good place because we have great engaged communities, both business and residents, and they know how to do business for themselves, and they know how to engage with each other in a lot of these places, and those networks are already well established. There's a lot of local resilience. So we as the local authority are engaging with all of those neighbourhood forums and providing as much resource as we can afford in a pretty resource-constrained environment to help them develop their thinking and ideas to bring forward their thinking and plans for their places. And we do have, you know, 2 or 3 areas that actually have first drafts of emergent plans that we're trying to work with them on, but it is pretty difficult stuff. So West Hampstead, Kentish Town and Bloomsbury, I think, are the people that are most advanced in terms of their thinking.
Are you happy with that answer for now?
Yeah.
I mean, if you want more about the process, then we can help. And you're interested in doing something, then we can help you get going. But I'm not sure this is a seminar.
I asked the organisers for a cage to put Ed in, because normally planners get it in the neck. But so he is on the record. You can question him now. I'm not necessarily going to have all things channeling through him now, but if you've got a comeback, we might come back to it. What would your response immediately be to that?
I mean, I have great sympathy with local government because I think that we actually have very little room to manoeuvre in the context of government, and we can see it's the age-old problem of different scales of power and input. And this whole growth story and narrative, which is like an example, is probably the main issue. I guess it's just, what is there that you can do to help accelerate and develop neighbourhood plans in a way that can contest quite destructive often national planning policies? It seems to me there's a technical issue there around just accelerating the process and just getting on with it and producing it.
Okay, we'll spin that one up in a bit, but let me ask everyone this question. Who feels that they are part of some kind of community-oriented planning conversation, experience, process, who lives and works in Camden? Hands up if you feel that you are in any way involved in something community-oriented in the planning domain. Okay, so not very many. Tegan, you're all about community. This is your big theory. Communities need to lead the planning process, and architects are too small and too up themselves, and urban designers are too big and too abstract. Solve this, please, because clearly these guys all live and work in Camden, but they're not involved in this sort of community stuff that these guys are trying to get off the ground. So how would you solve it?
So I'm really interested in the benevolent sort of dictator planner idea that somebody talked about here. Not that there needs to be one, but that a lot of what we're talking about right now seems to be description and criticism of process and not a lot about content. And I'm not sure if that is typical of all of the sort of dealings and planning at the government level, whether it's a national or local level, and as well as perhaps the community kind of like leaders. Like I don't know how much of the problem lies in the process. I'm interested in content more and thinking about how, like, actually...
So how do we get it? How do we get this community, presumably, I mean, it must come from the community in some way, or really reflect their interest. Where does it come from? How do we get it onto the table so that anybody could use it? Just content, forget process. Just how do we get community-oriented planning or place-making content to exist?
I think that the community meetings and supporting government support of community-based organizations is really important. But perhaps there needs to be some benevolent dictator group or architect or group of urban designers, somebody that can create a sort of master plan for a community that perhaps the community can have input on, but that there isn't so much of a... I think that it's hard for community members to see the larger picture, I guess, is the issue. And like I can't, even from conversations that we've had before in this conversation, I can't see the larger vision for Camden or the larger vision at a national level. And I'm not sure how to solve that problem either, but perhaps there's some way to create a bigger forum that people can tangibly feel like they're getting involved in the content of the plan.
Yeah, you want to say something, Yannick?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of jump in and sort of perhaps offer a slightly different perspective. We're looking at it very much from a top-down perspective, as in we will create a plan and then how do we get people involved. Do we not think that perhaps a slightly better way is to actually offer some support facilities for people to start setting up projects and services that they can start building up their own communities, and eventually they can decide when they have an idea of how it affects the community, how it is that they want to plan and set out their spaces.
So just get on and build stuff.
Get on and
plan around
from
it.
the bottom up.
Does that sound like chaos to you, Les? Are you in favour?
I'd like to tell a little story.
Okay.
It was an interaction between Thatcher and Mitterrand. And Margaret Thatcher says to Mitterrand, how come you guys can build a high-speed rail link from Paris to Calais in a year, and it takes us 10 years? And Mitterrand turned around and he said, when you're going to drain the pond, you don't consult the frogs. And, you get to a certain point where what you're planning to do is so big and so forward-thinking that you actually just have to do it. And the worst thing is that we end up doing these things. We do the high-speed lane, rail link, we build the airports, but it takes us 5 times as long to get to exactly the same position because nobody has the political willpower to tough it out, basically. So it may be that we have to identify what are the grand projets, those that are in the national interest or the regional interest, and those are the ones you live with. And then you develop a more local response to things that are at a much more local level.
Just so I understand you correctly, is there not an inconsistency? When you critique the Minister for Decentralisation and the government's framework for achieving local decision-making, because as far as I understood it, maybe I got it wrong, it overrides and damages the texture of places that have come through organically. Are you not countermanding that position by saying let's just build big railways with big grand projects? I mean, which is it? Should we respect texture in place or just build big things when we want to?
If we don't, we end up with status quo, which is unfortunately one of the byproducts of localism. But
let me, because I think this is one of the essential problems of the localist agenda is that we all want texture and place and identity and meaning, but we also want functioning infrastructure and we don't want endless consultation. So how would you cut that Gordian knot?
We have to balance. We have to then reinvest locally.
Okay.
And say we need to compensate for what's happened.
Yeah.
I don't think planning does enough local compensation.
Mm-hmm. Were you going to say something, Tegan? Are you going to jump in again, or are you just looking frustrated?
No. I think that's interesting. It's almost you're suggesting kind of almost a place-making credit system. We're going to put a Heathrow Airport extension in your backyard, but we're going to spend X amount of dollars. It's like putting, actually Louise, who's in the audience, would be really interested in this because as soon as you commodify something like place or environment or habitat or something, which is what her PhD is on, you end up putting a price on something like community that then can be bought. And that's not always a positive thing.
Okay, so you've just walked right into the trap. I mean, so I know you're not allowed to speak on behalf of your office, but you can speak on behalf of Starchitects and globally recognized architects in the abstract. Let's not mention your colleague. Surely you are the worst, the people you work for are the very worst in commodifying place and making them into faceless space, and the worst at in any way engaging with the community. Dig yourself out of that.
So I believe that, I said this in my initial sort of explanation. I think that architectural icon should not believe that it is creating place. I think that that communities and cities need to be planned in such a way that there is X amount of green space, X amount of market space, X amount of cultural centers, X amount of suburban, not suburban, housing, whatever kind of housing there needs to be. And then the community, businesses, leaders, everyone needs to fill in those spaces, and Starchitects do have a place in that icon. So in theory, if
things are planned as well as Ed would like, the Starchitect would fit in with all of the other pieces of the puzzle. In a world where that's not the case, do you feel you have a special responsibility? Not you or your office, or do you think that Starchitects and large offices should have a responsibility to respond to place and community, or should they just build monuments as they can with the money they get?
No, I do think that it's important to think about the fabric of a place. But I do think that something like the Bilbao effect, for instance, can't necessarily be, Bilbao is a museum in Spain built by Frank Gehry, and since it was finished, the town of Bilbao has just experienced an immense increase in tourism, and they've made tons of money. It's just a flourishing town now, and people say that the Bilbao effect is what Frank Gehry has caused there, is basically an architectural icon creating a new economic micro-system that has just really benefited the community because of its iconic nature. And so I think that there is the possibility for architectural icon to benefit a community in a really positive way that can't necessarily just be the building can't always be something that just fits in perfectly in the fabric if it's going to be that icon that could create change, positive change in the community.
So monuments can exist and interplay with more vernacular texture.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so let's think about Camden for a second. I'm not from here, obviously, but my understanding of Camden as a place is that its placeness has really evolved in spite of its architecture, rather than because of it. It seems as though there's a bit of a countercultural movement that has happened here that really defines what Camden is, and that everything that you would define Camden's placeness with is actually something that happens within the interstitial spaces between the architectural elements, not within the architectural spaces, right? So the point that I'm making, I guess, is that within an existing fabric, whether it's working perfectly infrastructurally or its parks are wonderfully flourishing, there is space for placemaking on streets and in empty spaces, warehouses. So I think that, in a way, the architecture is irrelevant to placemaking sometimes.
Let me try to springboard into part of the conversation which I think is a little bit harder for us to talk about when we have the assumption that we as communities or individuals or designers define scale. Guy and Yaniv, you were talking about a bunch of, you actually dropped in a few technical words like metabolism or industrial metabolism and so forth. I want to just unpack a little bit what that means in terms of placemaking and scale, because it seems to be that we probably have implicitly accepted in the conversation so far that we can define scale, we can define place endogenously inside our own interests and frameworks of preference and habitation and lifestyle. But would you agree, guys, that, the eco guys, that one of the things that happens when we start including the resource dimension in placemaking and built design, that we are unable to choose the optimal dimension. We have to accept constraints that are placed upon us. Would you agree with that, or is that not correct?
That sounds like an architectural question.
Well, let me frame it specifically for you then. You mentioned that energy is one of the issues that's coming down to the level of the community, for example. Don't you think that is ineffective to the extent that one thing we know about energy is that the larger the scale at which you produce it, the more efficient per unit you are? Why would we produce energy at a small scale if we know that that's wasting resources? If we know that that's a bad way to produce energy?
I guess, at least if you're doing it at a smaller scale, it's easier to start to get involved in making a difference. I think that one of the issues that we've got is that, the national energy policy is such a complex issue. It's a bit like the airports. There's a massive discussion going on at the moment as to where it should be. Well, the discussion over energy is far more complex than that, and trying to work out which route we should be going down is almost stultifying the government at the moment. So at least there's the opportunity to get engaged with the discussion on a more local level and feel that actually personally or as a community you've got some way of contributing to it. And actually, I guess, raising the awareness of it is one of the other big issues. The more that we become aware of it, the more pressure that there becomes, the more responsible we feel that we are, and the fact that we can do something about it.
So, Yaniv, when you talk about metabolism, firstly, could you explain that just so people understand what they mean? But also, just on that point, do you think that that what you mean by metabolism of resources at the urban scale, is it the same point as people being more responsible, or is it another kind of point? Do we need bigger scale thinking than individuals or households? Or
I'll come on to that just 2 seconds. There was just one thing I wanted to add, which was, I think whilst you might say that sort of local projects are slightly more inefficient, there is a few other points to take into account for. Transmission of energy over long distances, there's a huge loss purely in transmission. In addition to that, if you take a look at sort of what national policies are saying, it could easily be the case that if it's in the interest of the country to secure energy at a grand scale, fracking could be coming to your local community and you have nothing to say about that. If, however, local communities are able to start generating their own energy and start to almost become self-sufficient, they might be able to say to the government, look, we don't need to be part of this. We can be slightly off-grid. We don't need fracking in the back garden, and we need to be able to maintain our own security, so to speak. So I think there is something to say for local energy generation. With regards to cyclical metabolism, what we mean by that is essentially, there's a traditional notion of linear metabolism in cities. Effectively, resources come from the countryside, they get made into products, food, whatever it is that you want. They get consumed by the cities, and then they get used and dumped somewhere else on the other side of the world or in landfills. And the way in which nature works is not in that way. It works in a cyclical metabolism, i.e. there is no such thing as waste. The waste of one thing becomes a nutrient for another. And I think that as an idea for a city can mean sort of exchange of goods. It can mean anything. But the point being is that we try to upcycle things. And in terms of how these projects can end up linking together, if we start thinking about, for instance, that cardboard to caviar project, their cardboard was essentially being wasted by the restaurants that were just throwing them away. So effectively, Graham Wiles and a bunch of kids started collecting this cardboard. They shredded it up and sold it to equestrian centres. Now, once that was soiled, they were then paid to collect it again, and they took it to to compost heaps, which they then put in worms. They created worms and additional compost, which they then fed to Siberian sturgeon, which they created caviar, which they then sold back to the restaurant. So the potential for creating local projects that add productivity and connectedness can be applied at a city scale.
So that's basically taking a holistic approach to resource management, right?
Absolutely, but at the same time, there can be local projects that involve people.
Would you say that this idea of cyclical metabolism for the cycling and the management of resources, would you say that's based on solid science, or is it just a big idea? When you say it's like nature, that's not always the best starting point for scientific discussion.
Well, I think if you take the senses...
I'm not saying it's not. I don't want you to say it is or is not scientific.
I think in the long run, both the economy and the environment are one and the same.
Right.
Because essentially, if something is unenvironmental, it will eventually become uneconomical. We can't keep sustaining.
So it's basically scientific, what you're saying. It's not made up stuff.
Essentially, nature has sort of had 3.8 billion years of research and development to create some incredible adaptations. There's a project that we worked on with Bill Watts from Max Fordham called the Sahara Forest Project.
Yeah.
And essentially, we are starting reverse desertification by using solar power and seawater, which is inspired by a little black beetle called the Namibian fog-basking beetle. And
remember that, because you'll be tested later.
and it's a wonderful way in which you can learn from nature. Just to sort of explain that little beetle, just so I'm not sort of throwing things in the air.
Hold on. We'll come back to the beetle.
No problem.
I want to ask Guy, when you talk about landscaping, is this something of the same point that Yaniv is making about seeing resources in a more holistic light, rather than just a green tree that looks good, but finding its role in a bigger physical structure or concept of place or whatever?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a point that I want to come on to a bit later on. I don't want to steal my thunder from a point later, so I'm going to hold fire on that.
So let me ask you these two questions, Ed. If it's scientific and it makes abundant sense that we should cycle resources and it's good for everybody and it can be done at the local level, are you doing it? If not, why not?
I think the role of the planning system is to facilitate things, not to dictate things. So apart from in a benevolent form, obviously, for certain major scale projects. But, we are trying to strike the right balance between encouraging, say, microgeneration, where we've produced some localized guidance to help people who live in conservation areas, which are kind of our historic areas, our protected areas, make informed choices about what microgeneration solutions they might be able to pursue without coming a cropper via the planning process. At the other scale, we are trying to find major opportunities to take heat and power from some of our larger schemes and use that to provide affordable warmth to some of our more vulnerable people living in our housing estates. So we've got combined heat and power both on the major King's Cross site, but more recently at the Crick Institute, which is coming out of the ground just on the other side of St Pancras Station. So I think the role of the planning system is always to try and facilitate evolution of sustainable solutions whilst balancing it against a whole range of other things that get dumped at our door, I'm afraid.
But if the point is that resources are going to run out and the economy is going to go in that direction, what does it mean? Is it not mealy mouth to say we have to balance it against something else? It'd be like saying we have to balance child labour against costs of chewing gum.
I think the reality is the majority of housing and employment floor space that's coming out of the ground at the moment doesn't need to, once it's up and running, use any resources to heat itself because we're able to develop sustainable solutions in new build. I think the biggest challenge is the majority of what's already out there. Our existing terrace housing, which Guy was referring to, which we love as a kind of very flexible unit of housing that's done us well over the last 100 or 200 years, actually isn't very sustainable in its current form. So how do we help that evolve? And not all of that is to be resolved at the planning system level. There are, a series of other levers available to government and communities to pull in order to try and solve some of those problems.
So let's approach this question on the kind of obvious basis that a place like Camden is part of a larger structure, which is the City of London and scales of human organisation above that. What role does a place like Camden have in the larger structure, whether it's a city or a country or an ecosystem, however you want to frame it? Can we address that, just go step by step? Because I think one of the interesting things about the place conversation is not just what it is to make a place, but the implication of places connecting, what places mean for larger scales of organisation and built development. So come to you in the end. Yanni, go for it. What is the role of a place in any larger scale of organisation?
I think there's a few strands to go down, but just to start with, I think we have to consider that Camden itself is almost an icon of tourism. It has such an important place in showing how it is that both localism and, for me, sustainability sort of go hand in hand. And to sort of start expanding on strategies, projects, ideas that can really revitalize and show other areas how it is that they can bring in new industry and labor. And I think slowly but surely over time, all these sorts of projects that are coming into place, I'm talking about anything from urban agriculture projects, which can teach kids about agriculture and healthy food, to street markets, to public theatre, car-free zones, urban parks, all of these sorts of things. Once there's a shining beacon, once you have someone who's actually the first person to get this started, they're going to start replicating all over the place, and eventually I see the city, the way in which we inhabit our city, as being a very different place. Because what we don't have at the moment, in my opinion, are very strong leaders, benevolent dictators, that are able to push through these sorts of projects. And it's actually down to us, the very individual level, to start making these projects happen. And eventually, I believe what will happen is that we'll start allowing politicians to actually, for lack of better words, grow some balls, and to actually push these sorts of projects through and back these sorts of projects. But at a very basic level, it's down to us.
But I think, isn't that really important? Because at the end of the day, nobody wants to live in Disneyland, where you could say that Disneyland or Disney World has all of the things that you're talking about on some level. They have plays and they have markets and they have, but it's run by a conglomerate, or it's got the most benevolent dictator of all, I think that's also really, really negative, because place really is defined by the individuals and the people. So if anything, the benevolent dictator needs to be making a framework, not pushing through the content.
So we'll come back to you in a second, Les, but can you just kind of frame that response to Yanni? You get another bite of the cherry in a second, Yanni, but frame it in the sense of what happens beyond place. Because there are cities, and that's not just one place, it's a collection of places. There are countries, there is scale beyond place. What does that mean? How does place relate to the larger scale, or the larger complexity, or the larger system?
Meaning, I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
So what is the relationship, or what is the usefulness of Camden to London? It seems that what your point, Yanni, is it becomes an example. It's like light a candle and people can light their candles from that, right? Something like that.
Well, I don't think we're in disagreement.
No, we're not. No, I'm saying that I think at the end you were saying, but then the benevolent dictators need to take over. We're going to start as the small people who are...
Let me enforce the question just to get to grips with it. Are you saying there's no such thing as a city? It's just a bag of places? is there such a thing as a city or a country? Does that mean anything? And do places have an interrelationship with them, or is it just a place, everything is place, and the rest is just
There are cities that are without place, I would say. Particularly in the United States, many suburban cities, I think they're without place. They have, instead of a high street, what you call a high street, a downtown area, they have Walmart, and that's not a place. That is a globalized place.
What's your sense, Les, of how places relate to larger
Well,
arrangements?
I would take the larger, even further down the line, and look at it at a global level.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think the localism for me is really, the form is neighborhood, and I think neighborhood's absolutely wonderful. And we used to have fewer, more identifiable names. So, for example, the West End was Theatreland, and museums were at South Ken. And they were really identifiable. You would go there for a purpose, and there'd be some fringe things that you could do, and you could kind of encapsulate the whole experience or a trip. And in the background is globalism. Things are getting bigger and everything's more accessible. And then what I don't understand, and which I'm trying to kind of think through, is that suddenly there are more neighborhoods. And I'm driving across London and I go up the Caledonian Road. There's a big sign that says, the Cali. You're entering the Cali. I never for a moment saw Caledonian Road as a neighborhood, which it now is. You go through down Charlotte Street, which is a great little piece of London, and there's signs up saying, you're entering Fitzrovia. You know, and so suddenly neighborhoods are popping up and they're saying, you know, look at me, I've got an identity, I'm a place. And I'm saying, you know, is this the old donut effect that we went through, that as cities got bigger, they created holes in the middle and things had to come up and fill the hole? And maybe as people, or as communities, we need things in the face of globalism that are more tangible. And we need to identify, we need to sort of concretize our existence in these places in a much stronger fashion than we did before globalism was such an important thing.
So maybe you've reversed the question. So if I interpret you correctly, you're saying that it's a fiction to believe that London is a place. In actual fact, it's become something with holes in it, if you like.
It's not dissimilar to Europe. You know, now that we have a common Europe, what is the role of the nation state in there, apart from drawing a border around a language which doesn't even exist in some of those places? So if you think of Paris, are you actually thinking of Paris, or are you thinking of the Latin Quarter, or this arrondissement, or that particular landmark?
So just let me try something. It might not work because it might be a bit of a weird question. But if you had to choose an allegiance to a country or a place, in other words, you had to decide, I'm a citizen of Camden or I'm a citizen of the United Kingdom, who would choose, I'm a citizen of Camden? Hands up. Who would choose, I'm a citizen of the United Kingdom? Interesting. And well, I'm not going to ask 60 people why that is, but it's kind of fascinating. Why do you think that is, Les? Why do you think people have a... Because this is the point I'm trying to get to, which is that there seems to be an identity that exists beyond place, which is clearly a gravitational pull for people who come to a conversation on place.
It's a tough one, because I'm not sure that people actually look at themselves, or do they look at how people perceive them?
This is benevolent dictator talking, not looking at yourself sufficiently.
So when you have the conversation, and you normally, how do you introduce yourself to somebody that you've met? Someone will say, where do you come from? It's unlikely that you're down at that lower level, because you're looking at them and saying, oh, well, they're foreign. They're not going to identify Camden. They're going to identify the United Kingdom, or they're going to identify Europe. Like if you're in the US, somebody might say, well, I'm from Europe.
Let me jump in here before you go, because I just want to comment on that. So I've traveled a little bit, in very, very little, in fact, but one time in Africa, when I was in Uganda, in actual fact, that wasn't the case. They asked me, which village are you from? Which village? Which village? Because that is their frame of reference. When I said London, they said, London village, London village. And there wasn't an immediate sense of the nation identity, the regional identity. It was a very local level. My sense is that in terms of the larger issue is that one of the things that why we need, let's call them cities, but it doesn't really matter what word they are. It could be regions, any organizational unit for human settlements beyond the place, is that I think people have identity on different levels. I think that one of the things is that I like the idea that Camden exists, but I'm not sure I want to live here. I'd like to visit it conveniently and then go back to somewhere else in London, for example. And I think that what may define cities as functional units is a useful interaction, tension, overlapping of different places to create some cumulative identity that goes beyond. Because I think one of the reasons why people do identify with a national identity is it's a big soup. It's not just the separate items on the place. There's a kind of symphony, if I can mix my words, of flavors and colors and textures and meanings that becomes the larger unit of a city or a country. And that becomes somehow a more profound identifier. So I'm fascinated by how places relate to, and you're going to have to answer this in a second, Ed, to the larger city, because I think there must be some way to open up what they offer, more than just it being one place speaks to another place. Guy, how would you define usefully the relationship between place and city, for example, or any larger unit of settlement or organization?
I suppose the cities, I guess cities basically break down into neighborhoods. You're talking, it's people more readily identify themselves with a larger area, but actually it's much harder to make a difference if you start to identify yourself with that area. If you break it down, okay, yes, the majority here might say, identify with the UK, but actually you're a small piece of that. Whereas if you start to talk about a more localized community, there's actually an opportunity to do something about it. There's the talk about benevolent dictators. There's about generating a grand idea and kind of, allowing that to get the community together and get behind it, rather than getting the community to generate something themselves. So I think, what we need to do is we need to be getting the ideas coming forward. And I'm leading on to this point because I'd like to suggest an idea, which is sort of picking up on a number of things, particularly the points from earlier about terraced houses, and also, the points we've been making about greenery. And I think what we should do is we need to not be thinking about, individual properties, individual buildings, like, MTV have clad their building in greenery. That's fantastic. But we need to be thinking about entire streets doing this. And that means getting together, all the homeowners, all the businesses, talking to Camden Council. You're talking about doing it on a grand scale. So what you want to be doing is wrapping it up nice and warm, and then growing vertical gardens over it, having urban farming on the roof, reclaiming the streets, getting green corridors back, spaces for the children to run around so they aren't dominated by cars. You might even go as far as knocking down every 50th terrace so that you can connect through from one street to the other, and ending up with a sort of bit like New York where they have the High Line,
So,
this kind of incredible connection.
I have 3 points.
Yeah.
Okay, so first, a couple of you have kind of come up with suggestions that seem to actually, you're kind of suggesting that maybe China's model is better than Europe's or England's.
What is China's model? What do you mean by that?
That they might come up with an idea like banning sacks at the supermarket, and then they can say, okay, we're going to do that today, and then it has to happen. You're saying, like, let's just green the city, and we're just going to do it, and we're going to remove every 5th terrace. Or we're going to run a rail through the thing, and you have to put up with that, but we're going to reinvest in a different area. So there's kind of like this like anti-democracy kind of dictatorship happening. A bit. But then there's also the point that you're saying, so maybe there are, I'm playing devil's advocate because I actually think that this would be wonderful if there were vertical gardens everywhere, but say that there are people in the community that would say that's not what Camden is. Camden is not a place that is vertical gardens. It is a dirty market that has tons of flavor that has been organically grown for the past 40 years. And by knocking down terraces and creating green spaces and vertical gardens, we're erasing some of that character. That's a decision that somebody would have to make. And then the wide sweeping sort of changes would have to.
Are you critiquing that, or are you proposing that? This is your first point of 3.
I'm saying my first point is that a change like that requires someone or a group of people that have a lot of power saying that we're just going to do this, and it doesn't often happen that way.
So you're just commenting that power is not so easy to
It's not that easy, and I think that a lot of these ideas and a lot of the ways that maybe the largest changes in planning, and maybe they're positive changes, would occur is by something that is much more of a dictatorship rather than.
Okay.
But I think that's an issue that
and
needs
the other
to be
2
solved.
points. So the first point is accumulating power is hard. Other 2 points.
I'll remember them.
Okay,
Sorry.
you were going to come
I think I'm trying to suggest it's the other way around.
Right. Yeah.
That actually you come up with the idea, and then you start to try and convince people about what the benefits will be at the end, and you start to get the community behind it. because you're not going, if you've got a street which has got 50 different people who are owning little bits of it, you need to get everyone to buy into this as an idea. And so I think by starting to talk through what the benefits might be, I mean, it's going to be, it would be no mean feat to do it. It'd be incredibly complex. But, it's a creative community. That's the whole point of trying to come up with responses to these sorts of issues.
From the council's perspective, it's much easier if a whole street comes to us and says, this is what we want to do, how can you help us achieve it, rather than someone saying, we'd like to do this to a whole street, how can we impose it, if you see what I mean. So,
on the broader point, from your perspective in the planning office, how would you define, if at all, the role of Camden in the broader realm of placemaking, city, urbanism, and so forth? Are you part of larger conversations? Do you have time? How do you define your larger influence?
Very much so, and I suppose it gives me an opportunity to say that Camden isn't just Camden Town. So I think a lot of this conversation seems to focus on the role of Camden Town, which is perhaps within, a mile radius of this building, perhaps a slightly smaller area. But actually, Camden is a whole series of small communities and neighbourhoods, stretching from Highgate and Hampstead and Kilburn down to parts of Covent Garden and Holborn. So it is a very diverse area, and within each of those parts of Camden, you will have communities based on different levels of shared interest or coming together, sometimes around built form, sometimes around infrastructure like schools. So there's all sorts of different levels at which place operates within Camden, but the top-down vehicle for that, the political power, exists within the council for the London Borough of Camden as a local planning authority, but actually, or as a local authority of which planning is one of its functions. But actually, do you know what? Most people don't care that they're actually in Camden as a council. They care about that they live in Camden Town or Kentish Town or whatever, and they might not know that actually as a result of being in Camden as a local authority, they're lucky to be in one of the better boroughs, if not the best boroughs in London or in the UK, because they don't experience the services that they might receive living elsewhere. But we do absolutely engage in regional and national functions. So Camden, in the broader sense, provides a regional, sub-regional and national function for transport and employment. So, there are 3 mainline stations in the centre of Camden, and second highest or highest number of tube stations. We have millions of people commuting in and out of the borough to perform economic functions on behalf of the country on a daily basis, and our job is to make that experience as effective for them and for us as possible, and to support the national economy in that context. On a regional basis, we engage with the GLA on a regular basis, both around the technicalities of the planning system and what does or doesn't get planning permission, and how our plans do or don't reflect what the mayor wants to achieve. But we also engage with London at an economic level and at a sub-regional level with Central London Borough. So we are having a range of conversations in a different series of fora to try and manage a variety of expectations of people that will hopefully continue to make Camden a successful place. And the other thing I think that's missing in my kind of modern interpretation of what makes a place is most modern places these days seem to need a microbrewery and a bike shop to be able to identify themselves. But that might just be in certain parts of inner London.
So we've had a wide-ranging conversation. Predictably, there's a huge number of conversations that we've only sort of scratched at. But what we can do, since you've all kind of laid out positions, I'd like to sort of wrap it up by asking you each briefly to comment on this, which is, so you may end up reframing your points, and that's fine, but let's just leave it in a nutshell so people can take it away and ponder it. There are problems in the world at a large scale which go beyond place, and so they might include climate change, for example. It might include migration, it might include international poverty, it might include war and political instability, all sorts of grand things. How does placemaking localism contribute to solving the grandest problems of our or any time? Just 1 or 2 sentences each, and then we'll wrap it up. So start with you, Ed, and then you, Yaniv.
I suppose there are 4 words that I think have been kind of popping up in my mind as we've been having this discussion, which is about localism and localism's impact on place. And probably the most important word to a certain extent is honesty. So I think there has been a lack of honesty in the debate with local communities about how they can influence the future of their places and what is on the table for discussion and what isn't on the table in the way that the world is currently organised. And I think some communities have been misled, but there is a great opportunity for them to engage in and be part of designing their own future. But I think that then leads to my second point, which is that actually it is a collaborative, it can and should be a collaborative effort, and we have examples here in Camden of, I think of the British Land scheme at Regent's Place, where the community on its doorstep feels very much that it's been engaged in and supported by Regent's Place being developed over a number of years, because it's created open space and permeability for them, it's provided support for their schools, and it's provided work opportunities. So it can be a collaborative process at its best, and actually that creates the best places and the best solutions, because it's not an alien process, it's an inclusive process. That therefore means that some of the tension that seems inherent in the system, I think, can be dissipated if we're both honest and collaborative. But what the system really should be is flexible. We can't really design long-term plans that are rigid. We need to allow for communities to start to develop their own ideas and allow the frameworks of things that have been described earlier on be flexible enough to allow for a variety of solutions, be they individual streets wanting to green 50 of the houses, or individual micro pop-up businesses, or on a larger scale, recognising in Camden one of our big issues is the arrival of high-speed 2. Now that's a grand projet if ever I've heard of one, but it's creating problems for us.
So honest, collaborative and flexible.
Yeah.
Did I miss the fourth one in there?
That was tension.
Tension,
So, there is an inherent tension in the system. There always has been, there always will be. If you can operate in that way, then that tension hopefully will be lessened.
Honest, collaborative, tension, managing, and flexible.
Yeah.
Yaniv, just quickly, how do we frame the grandest issues of our time through the lens of place?
I think there's one thing we maybe quite haven't touched on, and I think that's education and the setting of values at a very early age. I think the sort of projects that we've been talking about, community projects, whether it's urban agriculture, all the rest of that, they're going to start setting the right type of values for the next generation of people that are coming through. And at that sort of scale, changes in political movements, changing everywhere are going to happen, and there will be the right kind of value set that actually want to get the future set in the right direction. Because the challenges that we have at the moment is that people are completely disconnected from the way in which we live. We don't know where our food comes from, we don't know where our energy comes from, we just live in the moment. We don't understand what's involved. And at that point, once we get some basic education, people will start making the right choices, in my opinion. So
my final comment, which responds to you, is I think if there is such a thing as a functioning local economy, by which I don't mean just bread and bicycles, but actually pretty much everything, so medicine and sufficient talent to construct actual buildings and so forth. If we have really functioning local economies, I think places will be engines of global solution finding.
You missed the microbrewery.
Microbrewery essential. Global. Guy.
So again, I mean, you talked about global issues, and you can see cities are made up of neighbourhoods. And I guess the global issues, in some degree, can be broken down as well to some of the local issues, and there's an opportunity to try and respond to those. And I mean, I think a lot of it's about kind of ideas and propositions. I mean, I live out in the countryside, and I'm on the local parish council for my sins. And occasionally, something really contentious will come up, and there's nothing that really gets everybody in the village to turn up and start talking about it as something that's contentious. And there is an opportunity, once you've got them all together, to then start to talk about, well, what is it that we should be doing? And then to start to come up with the good ideas and actually start to galvanise people to work towards something that's a lot more positive. And Ed was asking, we were asking questions earlier on about, how do you get the new neighbourhood plan going when there's nobody already doing something? Well, if you suggest you're going to knock half the neighbourhood down, you'll soon get everyone turning up to a meeting, and there's an opportunity to kind of start to seed something.
Yeah. So places is where the real conversations happen.
Yeah.
Okay. Tegan?
I think that basically, my view on, after this conversation particularly, on placemaking is that I think that places can't necessarily be planned for, and that one of the most important things to remember, if the goal is to make places, is that things like NIMBY or communities coming and rising up against a government that's trying to be a benevolent dictator, that's actually one of the most important things towards placemaking. And actually that status quo, quote unquote, in a neighborhood isn't necessarily a negative thing, because as long as there's a functioning government, a functioning economy, and neighborhood that's happening in a place, I think that's something that is worth preserving. And when I talk about, like, we need a dictator, I think that dictatorship is never the answer, obviously. But generally, that my main kind of takeaway is that wide sweeping planning is not a place's friend, and I'm not sure exactly how, as an architect, I can take that idea and try to apply it to my designs.
Wide sweeping planning is not a place's friend.
It's not a place's friend.
Les, so if there's grand problems out there, do places and placemaking and localism, does that contribute or not? And if so, how?
I think in devolving this amount of decision-making power to a local level, we're not managing expectations. Mm-hmm. And I fear that in 10 years' time, we'll have a minister of centralization come in to mop things up. And I want to throw a couple of words out there. We have localism. I think we also have localists, people who understand localism. And then I think we have localizers, who are the people who are active at a local level. And the localizers, I think, often misinterpret their own personal agenda for what is a local agenda. And there is a lack of consensus generally, and the power needs to move back to the localists who actually understand. It's easy to look back and say, oh, that decision was great or not good for the local area. You can look at what's on the table at the moment and say that might be okay, but to look forward and to plan and say this is actually going to take the neighborhood somewhere, it needs a much more informed quorum of people to run with that.
Great. Well, so hopefully in amongst the mosaic of conversation fragments, I'll have broadly proven the point that to ask what is a place and how does a place come to be and what is its implication, and it is a great key into questions of how we exist all around us. And so I'd like to thank the panel, Yaniv, Les, Tegan, Guy, and particularly Ed, who I think has had the hardest job digging out the answers from practice in Camden. I'd like to thank Ben and Ruth for setting up the whole event, and I'd like to thank you for co-creators of a place that's worth talking about. So a round of applause for everybody.